Chapter 12 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F. P. Walter. Chapter 12. Everything Through Electricity. "Sir," Captain Nemo said, showing me the instruments hanging on the wall of his stateroom, "these are the devices needed to navigate the Nautilus. Here, as in the lounge, I always have them before my eyes, and they indicate my position and exact heading in the midst of the ocean. You're familiar with some of them, such as the thermometer, which gives the temperature inside the Nautilus, the barometer, which measures the heaviness of the outside air and forecasts changes in the weather, the humidistat, which indicates the degree of dryness in the atmosphere, the storm glass, whose mixture decomposes to foretell the arrival of tempests, the compass, which steers my course, the sextant, which takes the sun's altitude and tells me my latitude, chronometers, which allow me to calculate my longitude, and finally spyglasses for both day and night, enabling me to scrutinize every point of the horizon once the Nautilus has risen to the surface of the waves." "These are the normal navigational instruments," I replied, "and I'm familiar with their uses. But no doubt these others answer pressing needs unique to the Nautilus. That dial I see there, with the needle moving across it. Isn't it a pressure gauge?" "It is indeed a pressure gauge. It's placed in contact with the water, and it indicates the outside pressure on our hull, which in turn gives me the depth at which my submersible is sitting." "And these are some new breed of sounding line?" "They're thermometric sounding lines that report water temperature in the different strata." "And these other instruments, whose functions I can't even guess?" "Here, professor, I need to give you some background information," Captain Nemo said, "so kindly hear me out." He fell silent for some moments, and then he said, "There's a powerful, obedient, swift, and effortless force that can be bent to any use and which reigns supreme aboard my vessel. It does everything. It lights me, it warms me, it is the soul of my mechanical equipment. This force is electricity." "Electricity!" I exclaimed in some surprise. "Yes, sir. But captain, you have a tremendous speed of movement that doesn't square with the strength of electricity. Until now, its dynamic potential has remained quite limited, capable of producing only small amounts of power." "Professor," Captain Nemo replied, "my electricity isn't the run-of-the-mill variety, and with your permission, I'll leave it at that." "I won't insist, sir, and I'll rest content with simply being flabbergasted at your results. I would ask one question, however, which you needn't answer if it's indiscreet. The electric cells you use to generate this marvelous force must be depleted very quickly. Their zinc component, for example, how do you replace it since you no longer stay in contact with the shore?" "That question deserves an answer," Captain Nemo replied. "First off, I'll mention that at the bottom of the sea there exist veins of zinc, iron, silver, and gold, whose mining would quite certainly be feasible. But I've tapped none of these land-based metals, and I wanted to make demands only on the sea itself for the sources of my electricity." "The sea itself?" "Yes, professor, and there was no shortage of such sources. In fact, by establishing a circuit between two wires immersed to different depths, I'd be able to obtain electricity through the diverging temperatures they experience. But I preferred to use a more practical procedure." "And that is?" "You're familiar with the composition of salt water. In 1,000 grams, one finds 96.5% water and about 2.66% sodium chloride. Then small quantities of magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, magnesium bromide, sulfate of magnesia, calcium sulfate, and calcium carbonate. Hence you observe that sodium chloride is encountered there in significant proportions. Now then, it is this sodium that I extract from salt water, and with which I compose my electric cells." "Sodium?" "Yes, sir. Mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam that takes the place of zinc in Bunsen's cells. The mercury is never depleted. Only the sodium is consumed, and the sea itself gives me that. Beyond this, I'll mention that sodium batteries have found to generate the greater energy, and their electromotor strength is twice that of zinc batteries." "Captain, I fully understand the excellence of sodium under the conditions in which you are placed. The sea contains it. Fine. but it still has to be produced, in short, extracted. And how do you accomplish this? Obviously your batteries could do the extracting, but if I'm not mistaken, the consumption of sodium needed by your electric equipment would be greater than the quantity you would extract. It would come about, then, that in the process of producing your sodium, you'd use up more than you'd make. Accordingly, Professor, I don't extract it with batteries. Quite simply, I utilize the heat of coal from the earth." "From the earth?" I said, my voice going up on the word. "We'll say coal from the sea floor, if you prefer," Captain Nemo replied. "And you can mine these veins of underwater coal?" "You'll watch me work then, Professor Aronnax. I ask only a little patience of you, since you'll have an ample time to be patient. Just remember one thing: I owe everything to the ocean. It generates electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus heat, light, motion, and, in a word, life itself." "But not the air you breathe?" "Oh, I could produce the air needed on board, but it would be pointless, since I can rise to the surface of the sea whenever I like. However, even though electricity doesn't supply me with breathable air, it at least operates the powerful pumps that store it under pressure in special tanks, which, if need be, allows me to extend my stay in the lower strata for as long as I want." "Captain," I replied, "I'll rest content with marveling. You've obviously found out what all mankind will surely find one day: the true dynamic power of electricity." "I'm not so certain they'll find it," Captain Nemo replied icily. "But be that as it may, you're already familiar with the first use I found for this valuable force. It lights us, and with a uniformity and continuity not even possessed by sunlight. Now look at that clock. It's electric. It runs with an accuracy rivaling the finest chronometers. I've had it divided into 24 hours like Italian clocks, since neither day nor night, sun nor moon, exist for me, but only this artificial light that I import into the depths of the sea. See, right now it's 10 o'clock in the morning. That's perfect. Another use for electricity: that dial hanging before our eyes indicates how fast the Nautilus is going. An electric wire puts it in contact with the patent log. This needle shows me the actual speed of my submersible. And, hold on, just now we're proceeding at the moderate pace of 15 miles per hour. "It's marvelous," I replied, "and I truly see, captain, how right you are to use this force. It's sure to take the place of wind, water, and steam." "But that's not all, Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo said, standing up, "and if you'd care to follow me, we'll inspect the Nautilus's stern." In essence, I was already familiar with the whole forward part of this underwater boat, and here are its exact subdivisions, going from amidships to its spur. The dining room, 5 meters long, and separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. In other words, it couldn't be penetrated by the sea. The library, 5 meters long. The main lounge, 10 meters long, separated from the captain's stateroom by a second watertight bulkhead. The aforesaid stateroom, 5 meters long. Mine, 2.5 meters long. And finally, air tanks, 7.5 meters long and extending to the stem posts. Total, a length of 35 meters. Doors were cut into the watertight bulkheads and were shut hermetically by means of India rubber seals, which ensured complete safety aboard the Nautilus in the event of a leak in any one section. I followed Captain Nemo down gangways located for easy transit, and I arrived amidships. There I found a sort of shaft leading upward between two watertight bulkheads. An iron ladder clamped to the wall led to the shaft's upper end. I asked the captain what this ladder was for. "It goes to the skiff," he replied. "What? You have a skiff?" I replied in some astonishment. "Surely. An excellent longboat, light and unsinkable, which is used for excursions and fishing trips." "But when you want to set out, don't you have to return to the surface of the sea?" "By no means. The skiff is attached to the top side of the Nautilus's hull and is set in a cavity expressly designed to receive it. It's completely decked over, absolutely watertight, and held solidly in place by bolts. This ladder leads to a manhole cut into the Nautilus's hull and corresponding to a comparable hole cut into the side of the skiff. I insert myself through this double opening into the longboat. My crew close up the hole belonging to the Nautilus. I close up the one belonging to the skiff simply by screwing it into place. I undo the bolts holding the skiff to the submersible, and the longboat rises with prodigious speed to the surface of the sea. I then open the deck paneling, carefully closed until that point. I upmast and hoist sail, or I take out my oars, and I go for a spin. But how do you return to the ship? I don't, Professor Aronnax. The Nautilus returns to me. At your command? At my command. An electric wire connects me to the ship. I fire off a telegram, and that's that. Right, I said, tipsy with all these wonders. Nothing to it. After passing the well of a companionway that led to the platform, I saw a cabin 2 meters long, in which Conseil and Ned Land, enraptured with their meal, were busy devouring it to the last crumb. Then a door opened into the galley, 3 meters long and located between the vessel's huge storage lockers. There, even more powerful and obedient than gas, electricity did most of the cooking. Arriving under the stoves, wires transmitted to platinum griddles a heat that was distributed and sustained with perfect consistency. It also heated a distilling mechanism that, via evaporation, supplied excellent drinking water. Next to this galley was a bathroom, conveniently laid out, with faucets supplying hot or cold water at will. After the galley came the crew's quarters, 5 meters long, but the door was closed and I couldn't see its accommodations, which might have told me the number of men it took to operate the Nautilus. At the far end stood a fourth watertight bulkhead, separating the crew's quarters from the engine room. A door opened, and I stood in the compartment where Captain Nemo, indisputably a world-class engineer, had set up his locomotive equipment. Brightly lit, the engine room measured at least 20 meters in length. It was divided by function into 2 parts. The first contained the cells for generating electricity, the second the mechanism transmitting movement to the propeller. Right off, I detected an odor permeating the compartment that was sui generis. Captain Nemo noticed the negative impression it made on me. That, he told me, is a gaseous discharge caused by our use of sodium. But it's only a mild inconvenience. In any event, every morning we sanitize the ship by ventilating it to the open air. Meanwhile, I examined the Nautilus's engine with a fascination easy to imagine. You observe, Captain Nemo told me, that I use Bunsen cells, not Ruhmkorff cells. The latter would be ineffectual. One uses fewer Bunsen cells, but they're big and strong, and experience has proven their superiority. The electricity generated here makes its way to the stern, where electromagnets of huge size activate a special system of levers and gears that transmit movement to the propeller's shaft. The latter has a diameter of 6 meters, a pitch of 7.5 meters, and can do it up to 120 revolutions per minute. And that gives you a speed of 50 miles per hour. There lay a mystery, but I didn't insist on exploring it. How could electricity work with such power? Where did this nearly unlimited energy originate? Was it in the extraordinary voltage obtained from some new kind of induction coil? Could its transmission have been immeasurably increased by some unknown system of levers? This was the point I couldn't grasp. Captain Nemo, I said, I'll vouch for the results and not try to explain them. I've seen the Nautilus at work out in front of the Abraham Lincoln, and I know where I stand on its speed. But it isn't enough just to move. We have to see where we're going. We must be able to steer right or left, up or down. How do you reach the lower depths, where you meet an increasing resistance that's assessed in hundreds of atmospheres? How do you rise back to the surface of the ocean? Finally, how do you keep your ship at whatever level suits you? Am I indiscreet in asking you all these things? Not at all, Professor, the captain answered after a slight hesitation, since you'll never leave this underwater boat. Come into the lounge. It's actually our workroom, and there you'll learn the full story about the Nautilus. End of chapter 12. Recording by Rick Cornwall.
Chapter 13 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Donnelly. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Some figures. A moment later, we were seated on the couch in the lounge, cigars between our lips. The captain placed before my eyes a working drawing that gave the ground plan, cross-section, and side view of the Nautilus. Then he began his description as follows. Here, Professor Aronnax, are the different dimensions of this boat now transporting you. It's a very long cylinder with conical ends. It noticeably takes the shape of a cigar, a shape already adopted in London for several projects of the same kind. The length of this cylinder from end to end is exactly 70 meters, and its maximum breadth of beam is 8 meters. So it isn't quite built on the 10-to-1 ratio of your high-speed steamers, but its lines are sufficiently long and they're tapering gradual enough so that the displaced water easily slips past and poses no obstacle to the ship's movements. These two dimensions allow you to obtain, via a simple calculation, the surface area and volume of the Nautilus. Its surface area totals 1,011.45 square meters. Its volume 1,507.2 cubic meters, which is tantamount to saying that when it's completely submerged, it displaces 1,500 cubic meters of water, or weighs 1,500 metric tons. In drawing up plans for a ship meant to navigate underwater, I wanted it, when floating on the waves, to lie 9/10 below the surface and to emerge only 1/10. Subsequently, under these conditions, it needed to displace only 9/10 of its volume, hence 1,356.48 cubic meters. In other words, it was to weigh only the same number of metric tons, so I was obliged not to exceed this weight while building it to the aforesaid dimensions. The Nautilus is made up of two hulls, one inside the other. Between them, joining them together, are iron T-bars that give this ship the utmost rigidity. In fact, thanks to this cellular arrangement, it has the resistance of a stone block, as if it were completely solid. Its plating can't give way, it's self-adhering and not dependent on the tightness of its rivets, and due to the perfect union of its materials, the solidarity of its construction allows it to defy the most violent seas. The two hulls are manufactured from boilerplate steel, which relative density is 7.8 times that of water. The first hull has a thickness of no less than 5 centimeters and weighs 394.96 metric tons. My second hull, the outer cover, includes a keel 50 centimeters high by 25 wide, which by itself weighs 62 metric tons. This hull, the engine, the ballast, the various accessories and accommodations, plus the bulkheads and interior braces, have a combined weight of 961.52 metric tons, which when added to 394.96 metric tons, gives us the desired total of 1,356.48 metric tons. Clear? Clear, I replied. So, the captain went on. When the Nautilus lies on the waves under these conditions, 1/10 of it does emerge above water. Now then, if I provide some ballast tanks equal to capacity to that 1/10, hence able to hold 150.72 metric tons, and if I fill them with water, the boat then displaces 1,507.2 metric tons, or it weighs that much, and it would be completely submerged. That's what comes about, Professor. These ballast tanks exist within easy access in the lower reaches of the Nautilus. I open some stopcocks and the tanks fill, the boat sinks, and it's exactly flush with the surface of the water. Fine, Captain, but now we come to a genuine difficulty. You're able to lie flush with the surface of the ocean, that I understand. But lower down, while diving beneath that surface, isn't your submersible going to encounter a pressure and consequently undergo an upward thrust, That must be assessed at 1 atmosphere per every 30 feet of water, hence at about 1 kilogram per each square centimeter. Precisely, sir. Then, unless you fill up the whole Nautilus, I don't see how you can force it down into the heart of these liquid masses. Professor, Captain Nemo replied, static objects mustn't be confused with dynamic ones, or will be open to serious error. Comparatively little effort is spent in reaching the ocean's lower regions, because all objects have a tendency to become sinkers. Follow my logic here. I'm all ears, Captain. When I wanted to determine what increase in weight the Nautilus needed to be given in order to submerge, I had only to take note of the proportionate reduction in volume that salt water experiences in deeper and deeper strata. That's obvious, I replied. Now then, if water isn't absolutely incompressible, at least it compresses very little. In fact, according to the most recent calculations, this reduction is only 0.0000436 per atmosphere, or per every 30 feet of depth. For instance, to go 1,000 meters down, I must take into account the reduction in volume that occurs under a pressure equivalent to that from a 1,000-meter column of water. In other words, under a pressure of 100 atmospheres. In this instance, the reduction would be 0.00436. Consequently, I'd have to increase my weight from 1,507.2 metric tons to 1,513.77. So the added weight would only be 6.57 metric tons. That's all? That's all, Professor Aronnax, and the calculation is easy to check. Now then, I have supplementary ballast tanks capable of shipping 100 metric tons of water, so I can descend to considerable depths. When I want to rise again and lie flush with the surface, all I have to do is expel the water, and if I desire that, the Nautilus emerge above the waves to 1/10 of its total capacity. I empty all the ballast tanks completely. This logic backed up my figures, left me without a single objection. I accept your calculations, Captain, I replied, and I'd be ill-mannered to dispute them, since your daily experience bears them out. But at this juncture, I have a hunch that we're still left with one real difficulty. What's that, sir? When you're at a depth of 1,000 meters, the Nautilus's plating bears a pressure of 100 atmospheres. If at this point you want to empty the supplementary ballast tanks in order to lighten your boat and rise to the surface, your pumps must overcome that pressure of 100 atmospheres, which is 100 kilograms per square centimeter. This demands a strength that electricity alone can give me, Captain Nemo said swiftly. Sir, I repeat, the dynamic power of my engines is nearly infinite. The Nautilus's pumps have prodigious strength, and as you must have noticed when their waterspouts swept like a torrent over the Abraham Lincoln. Besides, I use my supplementary ballast tanks only to reach an average depth of 1,500 to 2,000 meters, and that with a view to conserving my machinery. Accordingly, when I have a mind to visit the ocean depths 2 or 3 vertical leagues beneath the surface, I use maneuvers that are more time-consuming, but no less infallible. What are they, Captain? I asked. Here, I'm naturally led into telling you how the Nautilus is maneuvered. I can't wait to find out. In order to steer this boat to port or starboard, in short, to make turns on a horizontal plane, I use an ordinary, wide-bladed rudder that is fastened to the rear of the sternpost and worked by a wheel and tackle. But I can also move the Nautilus upward and downward on a vertical plane by the simple method of slanting its 2 fins, which are attached to its sides at its center of flotation. These fins are flexible, able to assume any position, and can be operated from inside by the means of powerful levers. If these fins stay parallel with the boat, the latter moves horizontally. If they slant, the Nautilus follows the angle of that slant, and under its propeller's thrust either sinks on a diagonal as steep as it suits me, or rises on that diagonal. And similarly, if I want to return more swiftly to the surface, I throw the propeller in gear, and the water's pressure makes the Nautilus rise vertically, as an air balloon inflated with hydrogen lifts swiftly into the skies. "Bravo, Captain!" I exclaimed. "But in the midst of the waters, how can your helmsman follow the course you've given him?" "My helmsman is stationed behind the windows of a pilot-house, which protrudes from the top side of the Nautilus's hull and is fitted with biconvex glass." "Is glass capable of resisting such pressures?" "Perfectly capable. Though fragile on impact, crystal can still offer considerable resistance. In 1864, during experiments on fishing by electric light in the middle of the North Sea, glass panes less than 7 millimeters thick were seen to resist a pressure of 16 atmospheres, all the while letting through strong heat-generating rays which warmth was unevenly distributed. Now then, I use glass windows measuring no less than 21 centimeters at their centers. In other words, they've 30 times the thickness." "Fair enough, Captain, but if we're going to sea, we need light to drive away the dark, and in the midst of the murky waters, I wonder how your helmsman can—" "Set astern of the pilot-house is a powerful electric reflector, whose rays light up the sea for a distance of half a mile." "Oh, bravo! Bravo 3 times over, Captain! That explains the phosphorescent glow from this so-called narwhale that so puzzled us scientists. Pertinent to this, I'll ask you if the Nautilus's running afoul of the Scotia, which caused such a great uproar, was the result of an accidental encounter?" "Entirely accidental, sir. I was navigating 2 meters beneath the surface of the water when the collision occurred. However, I could see that it had no dire consequences." "None, sir. But as for your encounter with the Abraham Lincoln, Professor, that troubled me, because it's one of the best ships in the gallant American Navy, but they attacked me and I had to defend myself. All the same, I was content simply to put the frigate in a condition where it could do me no harm. It wouldn't have any difficulty getting repairs at the nearest port." "Ah, Commander," I exclaimed with conviction, "your Nautilus is truly a marvelous boat." "Yes, Professor," Captain Nemo replied with genuine excitement, "and I love it as if it were my own flesh and blood. Aboard a conventional ship, facing the ocean's perils, danger lurks everywhere. On the surface of the sea, your chief sensation is the constant feeling of an underlying chasm, as the Dutchman Jansen has so aptly put it. But below the waves aboard the Nautilus, your heart never fails you. There are no structural deformities to worry about, because the double hull of this boat has rigidity of iron, no rigging to be worn out by rolling and pitching on the waves, no sail for the wind to carry off, no boilers for steam to burst open, no fires to fear. Because this submersible is made of sheet iron, not wood, no coal to run out of, since electricity is its mechanical force, no collisions to fear, because it navigates the watery deep all by itself, no storms to brave, because just a few meters beneath the waves it finds absolute tranquility. There, sir, there's the ideal ship, and if it's true that the engineer has more confidence in a craft than the builder, and the builder more than the captain himself, you can understand the utter abandon with which I place my trust in this Nautilus, since I'm its captain, builder, and engineer all in one." Captain Nemo spoke with winning eloquence. The fire in his eyes and the passion in his gestures transfigured him. Yes, he loved his ship the same way a father loves his child. But one question, perhaps indiscreet, naturally popped up, and I couldn't resist asking it. "You're an engineer then, Captain Nemo?" "Yes, Professor," he answered me. "I studied in London, Paris, and New York, back in the days when I was a resident of the Earth's continents." "But how were you able to build this wonderful Nautilus in secret?" Each part of it, Professor Aronnax, came from a different spot on the globe and reached me at a cover address. Its keel was forged by Conseil in France, its propeller shaft by Pen & Co. in London, the sheet iron plates for its hull by Laird's in Liverpool, its propeller by Scott's in Glasgow. Its tanks were manufactured by Cail & Co. in Paris, its engine by Krupp in Prussia, its spur by the Motala workshops in Sweden, its precision instruments by Hart Brothers in New York, etc., and each of these suppliers received my specifications under a different name. But, I went on, once these parts were manufactured, didn't they have to be mounted and adjusted? Professor, I set up my workshops on a deserted islet in mid-ocean. There our Nautilus was completed by me and my workmen. In other words, by my gallant companions whom I've molded and educated. Then, when the operation was over, we burned every trace of our stay on that islet, which if I could have, I'd have blown up. From all this, may I assume that such a boat costs a fortune? An iron ship, Professor Aronnax, runs 1,125 francs per metric ton. Now then, the Nautilus has a burden of 1,500 metric tons. Consequently, it cost 1,687,000 francs, hence 2 million francs including its accommodations, and 4 million francs, or 5 million francs with all the collections and works of art it contains. One last question, Captain Nemo. Ask, Professor. You're rich, then? Infinitely rich, sir, and without any trouble. I could pay off the 10 billion franc French national debt. I gaped at the bizarre individual who had just spoken these words. Was he playing on my credulity? Time would tell. End of chapter 13. Recording by Chris Donnelly, Devon, Alberta, Canada.
Of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Denton. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walker. Chapter 14. The Blackcurrant. The part of the planet Earth that the seas occupy has been assessed at 3,832,558 square myriameters, hence more than 38 billion hectares. This liquid mass totals 2,250,000,000 cubic miles, and could form a sphere with a diameter of 60 leagues, whose weight would be 3 quintillion metric tons. To appreciate such a number, we should remember that a quintillion is to a billion, but a billion is to one. In other words, there are as many billions in a quintillion as ones in a billion. Now then, this liquid mass nearly equals the total amount of water that has poured through all the Earth's rivers for the past 40,000 years. During prehistoric times, an era of fire was followed by an era of water. At first, there was ocean everywhere. Then, during the Silurian period, the tops of mountains gradually appeared above the waves, islands emerged, disappeared beneath temporary floods, rose again, were fused to form continents, and finally the Earth's geography settled into what we have today. Solid matter had wrested from liquid matter some 37,657,000 square miles, hence 12,916,000,000 hectares. The outlines of the continents allow the seas to be divided into 5 major parts: the frozen Arctic and Antarctic Oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean extends north to south between the 2 polar circles, and east to west between Asia and America over an expanse of 145 degrees of longitude. It's the most tranquil of the seas. Its currents are wide and slow-moving, its tides moderate, its rainfall abundant. And this was the ocean that I was first destined to cross under these strangest of auspices. "If you don't mind, Professor," Captain Nemo told me, "we'll determine our exact position and fix the starting point of our voyage. It's 15 minutes before noon. I'm going to rise to the surface of the water." The captain pressed an electric bell 3 times. The pumps began to expel water from the ballast tanks. On the pressure gauge, a needle marked the decreasing pressures that indicated the Nautilus's upward progress. Then the needle stopped. "Here we are," the captain said. I made my way to the central companionway, which led to the platform. I climbed its metal steps, passed through the open hatches, and arrived topside on the Nautilus. The platform emerged only 80 centimeters above the waves. The Nautilus's bow and stern boasted that spindle-shaped outline that had caused the ship to be compared, appropriately, to a long cigar. I noted the slight overlap of its sheet iron plates, which resembled the scales covering the bodies of our big land reptiles. So I had a perfectly natural explanation for why, despite the best spyglasses, this boat had always been mistaken for a marine animal. Near the middle of the platform, the skiff was half set in the ship's hull, making a slight bulge. Fore and aft stood 2 cupolas of moderate height, their sides slanting and partly inset with heavy biconvex glass, one reserved for the helmsman steering the Nautilus, the other for the brilliance of the powerful electric beacon lighting his way. The sea was magnificent, the skies clear. This long aquatic vehicle could barely feel the broad undulations of the ocean. A mild breeze out of the east rippled the surface of the water. Free of all mist, the horizon was ideal for taking sights. There was nothing to be seen. Not a reef, not an islet, no more Abraham Lincoln. A deserted immenseness. Raising his sextant, Captain Nemo took the altitude of the sun, which would give him his latitude. He waited for a few minutes until the orb touched the rim of the horizon. While he was taking his sights, he didn't move a muscle, and the instrument couldn't have been steadier in hands made out of marble. "Noon," he said. "Professor, whenever you're ready." I took one last look at the sea, a little yellowish near the landing places of Japan, and I went below again to the main lounge. There the captain fixed his position and used a chronometer to calculate his longitude, which he double-checked against his previous observations of our angles. Then he told me, "Professor Aronnax, we're in longitude 137 degrees 15 minutes west." "West of which meridian?" I asked quickly, hoping the captain's reply might give me a clue to his nationality. "Sir," he answered me, "I have chronometers variously set to meridians of Paris, Greenwich, and Washington, D.C., but in your honor I'll use the one for Paris." This reply told me nothing. I bowed, and the commander went on. "We're in longitude 137 degrees 15 minutes west of the meridian of Paris, and latitude 30 degrees 7 minutes north. In other words, about 300 miles from the shores of Japan. At noon on this day of November 8, we hereby begin our voyage of exploration under the waters." "May God be with us," I replied. "And now, Professor," the captain added, "I'll leave you to your intellectual pursuits. I've set our course east-northeast at a depth of 50 meters. Here are some large-scale charts on which you'll be able to follow that course. The lounge is at your disposal, and with your permission, I'll take my leave." Captain Nemo bowed. I was left to myself, lost in my thoughts. They all centered on the Nautilus's commander. Would I ever learn the nationality of this eccentric man who had boasted of having none? His sworn hate for humanity, a hate that perhaps was bent on some dreadful revenge. What had provoked it? Was he one of those unappreciated scholars, one of those geniuses embittered by the world, as Conseil expressed it, a latter-day Galileo? Or maybe one of those men of science like America's Commander Maury, whose careers were ruined by political revolutions? I couldn't say yet. As for me, whom fate had just brought aboard his vessel, whose life he had held in the balance, he had received me coolly, but hospitably. Only he never took the hand I extended to him. He never extended his own. For an entire hour I was deep in these musings, trying to probe this mystery that fascinated me so. Then my eyes focused on a huge world map displayed on the table, and I put my finger on the very spot where our just determined longitude and latitude intersected. Like the continents, the sea has its rivers. These are exclusive currents that can be identified by their temperature and color, the most remarkable being the one called the Gulf Stream. Science has defined the global paths of 5 chief currents: one in the North Atlantic, a second in the South Atlantic, a third in the North Pacific, a fourth in the South Pacific, and a fifth in the Southern Indian Ocean. Also, it's likely that a sixth current used to exist in the Northern Indian Ocean, when the Caspian and Aral Seas joined up with certain large Asian lakes to form a single uniform expanse of water. Now then, at the spot indicated on the world map, one of these seagoing rivers was rolling by, the Kuroshio of the Japanese, the Blackcurrant. Heated by perpendicular rays from the tropical sun, it leaves the Bay of Bengal, crosses the Strait of Malacca, goes up the shores of Asia, and curves into the North Pacific as far as the Aleutian Islands, carrying along trunks of camphor trees and other local items, the pure indigo of its warm waters sharply contrasting with the ocean's waves. It was this current the Nautilus was about to cross. I watched it on the map with my eyes. I saw it lose itself in the immenseness of the Pacific, and I felt myself swept along with it, when Ned Land and Conseil appeared in the lounge doorway. My 2 gallant companions stood petrified at the sight of the wonders on display.
"Where are we?" the Canadian exclaimed. "In the Quebec Museum?" "Begging master's pardon," Conseil answered, "but this seems more like the Sommerard Artifacts exhibition." "My friends," I replied, signaling them to enter, "you're in neither Canada nor France, but securely aboard the Nautilus, 50 meters below sea level."
"If master says so, then so be it," Conseil answered. "But in all honesty, this lounge is enough to astonish even someone Flemish like myself." "Indulge your astonishment, my friend, and have a look, because there's plenty of work here for a classifier of your talents." Conseil needed no encouraging. Bending over the glass cases, the gallant lad was already muttering choice words from the naturalist's vocabulary. Class Gastropoda, family Buccinoidea, genus Cowrie, species Cyprea madagascariensis, etc. Meanwhile, Ned Land, less dedicated to conchology, questioned me about my interview with Captain Nemo. Had I discovered who he was, where he came from, where he was heading, how deep he was taking us? In short, 1,000 questions I had no time to answer. I told him everything I knew, or rather everything I didn't know, and I asked him what he had seen or heard on his part. "Haven't seen or heard a thing," the Canadian replied. "I haven't even spotted the crew of this boat. By any chance, could they be electric too?" "Electric? Oh, ye gods, I'm half tempted to believe it. But back to you, Professor Aronnax," Ned Land said, still hanging on to his ideas. "Can't you tell me how many men are on board? 10, 20, 50, 100? I'm unable to answer you, Mr. Land. And trust me on this. For the time being, get rid of these notions of taking over the Nautilus or escaping from it. This boat is a masterpiece of modern technology, and I'd be sorry to have missed it. Many people would welcome the circumstances that have been handed us, just to walk in the midst of these wonders. So keep calm, and let's see what's happening around us." "See?" the harpooner exclaimed. "There's nothing to see. Nothing we'll ever see from this sheet iron prison. We're simply running around blindfolded." Ned Land was just pronouncing these last words when we were suddenly plunged into darkness, utter darkness. The ceiling lights went out so quickly my eyes literally ached, just as if we had experienced the opposite sensation of going from the deepest gloom to the brightest sunlight. We stood stock still, not knowing what surprise was waiting for us, whether pleasant or unpleasant. But a sliding sound became audible. You could tell that some panels were shifting over the Nautilus's sides. "It's the beginning of the end," Ned Land said. "Order Hydromedusa," Conseil muttered. Suddenly, through 2 oblong openings, daylight appeared on both sides of the lounge. The liquid masses came into view, brightly lit by the ship's electric outpourings. We were separated from the sea by 2 panes of glass. Initially, I shuddered at the thought that these fragile partitions could break, but strong copper bands secured them, giving them nearly infinite resistance. The sea was clearly visible for a 1-mile radius around the Nautilus. What a sight! What pen could describe it? Who could portray the effects of this light through the translucent sheets of water, the subtlety of its progressive shadings into the ocean's upper and lower strata? The transparency of salt water has long been recognized. Its clarity is believed to exceed that of spring water. The mineral and organic substances it holds in suspension actually increase its translucency. In certain parts of the Caribbean Sea, you can see the sandy bottom with startling distinctness, as deep as 145 meters down, and the penetrating power of the sun's rays seemed to give out only at a depth of 300 meters. But in this fluid setting, traveled by the Nautilus, our electric glow was being generated in the very heart of the waves. It was no longer illuminated water, it was liquid light. If we accept the hypotheses of the microbiologist Ehrenberg, who believes that these underwater depths are lit up by phosphorescent organisms, nature has certainly saved one of her most prodigious sights for residents of the sea, and I could judge for myself from the thousandfold play of the light. On both sides I had windows opening over these unexplored depths. The darkness in the lounge enhanced the brightness outside, and we stared as if this clear glass were the window of an immense aquarium. The Nautilus seemed to be standing still. This was due to the lack of landmarks, but streaks of water, parted by the ship's spur, sometimes threaded before our eyes with extraordinary speed. In wonderment, we leaned on our elbows before these show windows, and our stunned silence remained unbroken until Conseil said, "You wanted to see something, Ned, my friend. Well, now you have something to see." "How unusual," the Canadian put in, setting aside his tantrums and getaway schemes while submitting to this irresistible allure. "A man would go an even greater distance just to stare at such a sight." "Ah," I exclaimed, "I see our captain's way of life. He's found himself a separate world that saves its most astonishing wonders just for him." "But where are the fish?" the Canadian ventured to observe. "I don't see any fish." "Why would you care, Ned, my friend?" Conseil replied, "since you have no knowledge of them." "Me? A fisherman?" Ned Land exclaimed. And on this subject a dispute arose between the two friends, since both were knowledgeable about fish, but from totally different standpoints. Everyone knows that fish make up the fourth and last class in the vertebrate branch. They have been quite aptly defined as, quote, "cold-blooded vertebrates with a double circulatory system breathing through gills and designed to live in water," unquote. They consist of two distinct series: the series of bony fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of bone, and cartilaginous fish, in other words, those whose spines have vertebrae made of cartilage. Possibly the Canadian was familiar with this distinction, but Conseil knew far more about it, and since he and Ned were now fast friends, he just had to show off. So he told the harpooner, "Ned, my friend, you're a slayer of fish, a highly skilled fisherman. You've caught a large number of these fascinating animals, but I'll bet you don't know how they're classified." "Sure I do," the harpooner replied in all seriousness. "They're classified into fish we eat and fish we don't eat." "Spoken like a true glutton," Conseil replied. "But tell me, are you familiar with the differences between bony fish and cartilaginous fish?" "Just maybe, Conseil." "And how about the subdivisions of these two large classes?" "I haven't the foggiest notion," the Canadian replied. "All right, listen and learn, Ned, my friend. Bony fish are subdivided into 6 orders. Primo, the acanthopterygians, whose upper jaw is fully formed and free-moving, and whose gills take the shape of a comb. This order consists of 15 families, in other words, 3/4 of all known fish. Example, the common perch." "Pretty fair eating," Ned Land replied. "Secundo," Conseil went on, "the abdominals, whose pelvic fins hang under the abdomen to the rear of the pectorals, but aren't attached to the shoulder bone, an order that's divided into 5 families and makes up the large majority of freshwater fish. Examples, carp, pike." "Ugh!" the Canadian put in with distinct scorn. "You can keep the freshwater fish." "Tertio," Conseil said, "the subbrachians, whose pelvic fins are attached under the pectorals and hang directly from the shoulder bone. This order contains 4 families. Examples, flatfish such as sole, turbot, dab, plaice, brill, etc." Excellent, really excellent, the harpooner exclaimed, interested in fish only from an edible viewpoint. Quarto, Conseil went on, unabashed, the apods, with long bodies that lack pelvic fins and are covered by a heavy, often glutinous skin, an order consisting of only one family. Examples, common eels and electric eels. So-so, just so-so, Ned Land replied. Quinto, Conseil said, the lophobranchians, which have fully formed, free-moving jaws, but whose gills consist of little tufts arranged in pairs along their gill arches. This order includes only one family. Examples, seahorses and dragonfish. Bad, very bad, the harpooner replied. Sexto and last, Conseil said, the plectognaths, whose maxillary bone is firmly attached to the side of the intermaxillary that forms the jaw, and whose palate arch is locked to the jaw by sutures that render the jaw immovable, an order lacking true pelvic fins, and which consists of two families. Examples, puffers and moonfish. There, an insult to the frying pan, the Canadian exclaimed. Are you grasping all this, Ned, my friend? Asked the scholarly Conseil. Not a lick of it, Conseil, my friend, the harpooner replied, but keep going, because you fill me with fascination. As for cartilaginous fish, Conseil went on unflappably, they consist of only three orders. Good news, Ned put in. Primo, the cyclostomes, whose jaws are fused into a flexible ring, and whose gill openings are simply a large number of holes, an order consisting of only one family. Example, the lamprey. An acquired taste, Ned Land replied. Secundo, the selacians, with gills resembling those of the cyclostomes, but whose lower jaw is free-moving. This order, which is the most important in the class, consists of two families. Examples, the ray and the shark. What? Ned Land exclaimed. Rays and man-eaters in the same order? Well, Conseil, my friend, on behalf of the rays, I wouldn't advise you to put them in the same fish tank. Tertio, Conseil replied, the sturionians, whose gill opening is the usual single slit adorned with a gill cover, an order consisting of four genera. Example, the sturgeon. Oh, Conseil, my friend, you saved the best for last, in my opinion anyhow. And that's all of them? Yes, my gallant Ned, Conseil replied, and note well, even when one has grasped all this, one still knows next to nothing, because these families are subdivided into genera, subgenera, species, varieties. All right, Conseil, my friend, the harpooner said, leaning toward the glass panel. Here comes a couple of your varieties now. Yes, fish, Conseil exclaimed. One would think he was in front of an aquarium. No, I replied, because an aquarium is nothing more than a cage, and these fish are as free as birds in the air. Well, Conseil, my friend, identify them. Start naming them, Ned Land exclaimed. Me, Conseil replied, I'm unable to. That's my employer's bailiwick. And in truth, although the fine lad was a classifying maniac, he was no naturalist, and I doubt that he could tell a bonito from a tuna. In short, he was the exact opposite of the Canadian, who knew nothing about classification, but could instantly put a name to any fish. A triggerfish, I said. It's a Chinese triggerfish, Ned Land replied. Genus Balistes, family Scleroderma, order Plectognatha, Conseil muttered. Assuredly, Ned and Conseil, in combination, added up to one outstanding naturalist. The Canadian was not mistaken. Cavorting around the Nautilus was a school of triggerfish, with flat bodies, grainy skins, armed with stings on their dorsal fins, and with four prickly rows of quills quivering on both sides of their tails. Nothing could have been more wonderful than the skin covering them, white underneath, gray above, with spots of gold sparkling in the dark eddies of the waves. Around them, rays were undulating like sheets flapping in the wind, and among these I spotted, much to my glee, a Chinese ray, yellowish on its top side, a dainty pink on its belly, and armed with three stings behind its eyes. A rare species whose very existence was still doubted in Lacepède's day, since that pioneering classifier of fish had seen one only in a portfolio of Japanese drawings. For 2 hours, a whole aquatic army escorted the Nautilus. In the midst of their leaping and cavorting, while they competed with each other in beauty, radiance, and speed, I could distinguish some green wrasse, the whiskered mullet marked with pairs of black lines, white gobies from the genus Eleotris with curved caudal fins and violet spots on the back, wonderful Japanese mackerel from the genus Scomber with blue bodies and silver heads, glittering azure goldfish, whose name by itself gives their full description.
Several varieties of porgy or gilthead, some banded gilthead with fins variously blue and yellow, some with horizontal heraldic bars and enhanced by a black strip around their caudal area, some with color zones and elegantly corseted in their 6 waistbands.
Trumpet fish with flute-like beaks that looked like genuine seafaring woodcocks and were sometimes a meter long. Japanese salamanders, serpentine moray eels from the genus Echidna that were 6 feet long with sharp little eyes and a huge mouth bristling with teeth, etc. Our wonderment stayed at an all-time fever pitch. Our exclamations were endless. Ned identified the fish, Conseil classified them, and as for me, I was in ecstasy over the verve of their movements and the beauty of their forms. Never before had I been given the chance to glimpse these animals alive and at large in their native element. Given such a complete collection from the seas of Japan and China, I won't mention every variety that passed before our dazzled eyes. More numerous than birds in the air, these fish raced right up to us, no doubt attracted by the brilliant glow of our electric beacon. Suddenly daylight appeared in the lounge. The sheet iron panels slid shut. The magical vision disappeared, but for a good while I kept dreaming away, until the moment my eyes focused on the instruments hanging on the wall. The compass still showed our heading as east-northeast. The pressure gauge indicated a pressure of 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 50 meters, and the electric log gave our speed as 15 miles per hour. I waited for Captain Nemo, but he didn't appear. The clock marked the hour of 5. Ned Land and Conseil returned to their cabin. As for me, I repaired to my stateroom. There I found dinner ready for me. It consisted of turtle soup made from the daintiest hawksbill, a red mullet with white, slightly flaky fish, whose liver, when separately prepared, makes delicious eating, plus loin of imperial angelfish, whose flavor struck me as even better than salmon. I spent the evening in reading, writing, and thinking. Then drowsiness overtook me. I stretched out on my eelgrass mattress, and I fell into a deep slumber, while the Nautilus glided through the swiftly flowing Blackcurrant. End of chapter 14.
Of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Morant. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F. P. Walter. Chapter 15. An Invitation in Writing. The next day, November 9th, I woke up only after a long 12-hour slumber. Conseil, a creature of habit, came to ask how master's night went, and to offer his services. He had left his Canadian friend sleeping like a man who had never done anything else. I let the gallant lad babble as he pleased, without giving him much in the way of a reply. I was concerned about Captain Nemo's absence during our session the previous afternoon, and I hoped to see him again today. Soon I had put on my clothes, which were woven from strands of seashell tissue. More than once their composition provoked comments from Conseil. I informed him that they were made from the smooth, silken filaments with which the fan mussel, a type of seashell quite abundant along Mediterranean beaches, attaches itself to rocks. In olden times, fine fabrics, stockings, and gloves were made from such filaments, because they were both very soft and very warm, so the Nautilus's crew could dress themselves at little cost, without needing a thing from cotton growers, sheep, or silkworms on shore. As soon as I was dressed, I made my way to the main lounge. It was deserted. I dove into studying the conchological treasures amassed inside the glass cases. I also investigated the huge plant albums that were filled with the rarest marine herbs, which, although they were pressed and dried, still kept their wonderful colors. Among these valuable water plants I noted various seaweed, some Cladostephus verticulatus, peacock's tails, fig-leafed caulerpa, grain-bearing beauty bushes, delicate rose-tangle tinted scarlet, sea coriander arranged into fan shapes, mermaids' cups that looked like the caps of squat mushrooms and for years had been classified among the zoophytes, in short, a complete series of algae. The entire day passed without my being honored by a visit from Captain Nemo. The panels in the lounge didn't open. Perhaps they didn't want us to get tired of these beautiful things. The Nautilus kept to an east-northeasterly heading, a speed of 12 miles per hour, and a depth between 50 and 60 meters. Next day, November 10th, the same neglect, the same solitude. I didn't see a soul from the crew. Ned and Conseil spent the better part of the day with me. They were astonished at the captain's inexplicable absence. Was this eccentric man ill? Did he want to change his plans concerning us? But after all, as Conseil noted, we enjoyed complete freedom. We were daintily and abundantly fed. Our host had kept to the terms of his agreement. We couldn't complain, and moreover the very uniqueness of our situation had such generous rewards in store for us. We had no grounds for criticism. That day I started my diary of these adventures, which has enabled me to narrate them with the most scrupulous accuracy. And one odd detail, I wrote it on paper manufactured from marine eelgrass. Early in the morning on November 11th, fresh air poured through the Nautilus's interior, informing me that we had returned to the surface of the ocean to renew our oxygen supply. I headed for the central companionway and climbed onto the platform. It was 6 o'clock. I found the weather overcast, the sea gray but calm, hardly a billow. I hoped to encounter Captain Nemo there. Would he come? I saw only the helmsman imprisoned in his glass-windowed pilot-house. Seated on the ledge furnished by the hull of the skiff, I inhaled the sea's salty aroma with great pleasure. Little by little, the mists were dispersed under the action of the sun's rays. The radiant orb cleared the eastern horizon. Under its gaze, the sea caught on fire like a trail of gunpowder. Scattered on high, the clouds were colored in bright, wonderfully shaded hues, and numerous lady fingers warned of day-long winds. Author's note: lady fingers are small, thin, white clouds with ragged edges. But what were mere winds to this Nautilus, which no storms could intimidate? So I was marveling at this delightful sunrise, so life-giving and cheerful, when I heard someone climbing onto the platform. I was prepared to greet Captain Nemo, but it was his chief officer who appeared, whom I had already met during our first visit with the captain. He advanced over the platform, not seeming to notice my presence. A powerful spyglass to his eye, he scrutinized every point of the horizon with the utmost care. Then, his examination over, he approached the hatch and pronounced a phrase whose exact wording follows below. I remember it because, every morning, it was repeated under the same circumstances. It ran like this: Nautron respach lorni birch. What it meant, I was unable to say. These words pronounced, the chief officer went below again. I thought the Nautilus was about to resume its underwater navigating. So I went down the hatch and back through the gangways to my stateroom. 5 days passed in this way with no change in our situation. Every morning I climbed onto the platform. The same phrase was pronounced by the same individual. Captain Nemo did not appear. I was pursuing the policy that we had seen the last of him when on November 16th, while re-entering my stateroom with Ned and Conseil, I found a note addressed to me on the table. I opened it impatiently. It was written in a script that was clear and neat but a bit Old English in style, its characters reminding me of German calligraphy. The note was worded as follows: Professor Aronnax, aboard the Nautilus, November 16th, 1867. Captain Nemo invites Professor Aronnax on a hunting trip that will take place tomorrow morning in his Crespo Island forests. He hopes nothing will prevent the professor from attending, and he looks forward with pleasure to the professor's companions joining him. Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. "A hunting trip!" Ned exclaimed. "And in his forests on Crespo Island," Conseil added. "But does this mean the old boy goes ashore?" Ned Land went on. "That seems to be the gist of it," I said, rereading the letter. "Well, we've got to accept," the Canadian answered. "Once we're on solid ground, we'll figure out a course of action. Besides, it wouldn't pain me to eat a couple slices of fresh venison." Without trying to reconcile the contradictions between Captain Nemo's professed horror of continents or islands and his invitation to go hunting in a forest, I was content to reply, "First, let's look into this Crespo Island." I consulted the world map, and in latitude 32 degrees 40 north and longitude 167 degrees 50 west, I found an islet that had been discovered in 1801 by Captain Crespo, which old Spanish charts called Roca de la Plata, in other words, Silver Rock. So we were about 1,800 miles from our starting point, and by a slight change of heading, the Nautilus was bringing us back toward the southeast. I showed my companions this small, stray rock in the middle of the North Pacific. "If Captain Nemo does sometimes go ashore," I told them, "at least he only picks desert islands." Ned Land shook his head without replying. Then he and Conseil left me. After supper was served me by the mute and emotionless steward, I fell asleep, but not without some anxieties. When I woke up the next day, November 17th, I sensed that the Nautilus was completely motionless. I dressed hurriedly and entered the main lounge. Captain Nemo was there waiting for me. He stood up, bowed, and asked if it suited me to come along. Since he made no allusion to his absence the past 8 days, I also refrained from mentioning it, and I simply answered that my companions and I were ready to go with him. "Only, sir," I added, "I'll take the liberty of addressing a question to you." "Address away, Professor Aronnax, and if I'm able to answer, I will." "Well then, Captain, how is it that you've severed all ties with the shore, yet you own forests on Crespo Island?" "Professor," the captain answered me, "these forests of mine don't bask in the heat and light of the sun. They aren't frequented by lions, tigers, panthers, or other quadrupeds. They're known only to me. They grow only for me. These forests aren't on land, they're actual underwater forests." "Underwater forests?" I exclaimed. "Yes, Professor." "And you're offering to take me to them?" "Precisely." "On foot? Without getting your feet wet?" "While hunting." "While hunting? Rifles in hand?" "Rifles in hand." I stared at the Nautilus's commander with an air anything but flattering to the man. "Assuredly," I said to myself, "he's contracted some mental illness. He's had a fit that's lasted 8 days and isn't over even yet. What a shame! I liked him better eccentric than insane." These thoughts were clearly readable on my face, but Captain Nemo remained content with inviting me to follow him, and I did so like a man resigned to the worst. We arrived at the dining room, where we found breakfast served. "Professor Aronnax," the captain told me, "I beg you to share my breakfast without formality. We can chat while we eat, because although I promised you a stroll in my forests, I made no pledge to arrange for your encountering a restaurant there. Accordingly, eat your breakfast like a man who will probably eat dinner only when it's extremely late." I did justice to this meal. It was made up of various fish and some slices of sea cucumber, that praiseworthy zoophyte, all garnished with such highly appetizing seaweed as the Porphyra laciniata and the Laurentia prima fetida. Our beverage consisted of clear water, to which, following the captain's example, I added some drops of a fermented liqueur extracted by the Kamchatka process from the seaweed known by the name as Rhodymenia palmata. At first, Captain Nemo ate without pronouncing a single word. Then he told me, "Professor, when I proposed that you go hunting in my Crespo forests, You thought I was contradicting myself. When I informed you that it was an issue of underwater forests, you thought I'd gone insane. Professor, you must never make snap judgments about your fellow man. But, Captain, believe me. Kindly listen to me, and you'll see if you have grounds for accusing me of insanity or self-contradiction. I'm all attention. Professor, you know as well as I do that a man can live underwater so long as he carries with him his own supply of breathable air. For underwater work projects, the workman wears a waterproof suit with his head imprisoned in a metal capsule, while he receives air from above by means of force pumps and flow regulators. That's the standard equipment for a diving suit, I said. Correct. But under such conditions, the man has no freedom. He's attached to a pump that sends him air through an India rubber hose. It's an actual chain that fetters him to the shore, and if we were to be bound in this way to the Nautilus, we couldn't go far either. Then how do you break free? I asked. We use the Rouquayrol Denerouze device, invented by two of your fellow countrymen but refined by me for my own special uses, thereby enabling you to risk these new physiological conditions without suffering any organic disorders. It consists of a tank built from heavy sheet iron in which I store air under a pressure of 50 atmospheres. This tank is fastened to the back by means of straps, like a soldier's knapsack. Its top part forms a box where the air is regulated by a bellows mechanism and can be released only at its proper tension. In the Rouquayrol device that has been in general use, two India rubber hoses leave this box and feed to a kind of tent that imprisons the operator's nose and mouth. One hose is for the entrance of air to be inhaled, the other for the exit of air to be exhaled, and the tongue closes off the former or the latter depending on the breather's needs. But in my case, since I faced considerable pressure at the bottom of the sea, I needed to enclose my head in a copper sphere, like those found on standard diving suits, and the two hoses for inhalation and exhalation now feed to that sphere. That's perfect, Captain Nemo, but the air you carry must be quickly depleted, and once it contains no more than 15% oxygen, it becomes unfit for breathing. Surely, but as I told you, Professor Aronnax, the Nautilus's pumps enable me to store air under considerable pressure, and given this circumstance, the tank on my diving equipment can supply breathable air for 9 or 10 hours. I've no more objections to raise, I replied. I'll only ask you, Captain, how can you light your way at the bottom of the ocean? With the Ruhmkorff device, Professor Aronnax. If the first is carried on the back, the second is fastened to the belt. It consists of a Bunsen battery that I activate not with potassium dichromate, but with sodium. An induction coil gathers the electricity generated and directs it to a specially designed lantern. In this lantern, one finds a glass spiral that contains only a residue of carbon dioxide gas. When the device is operating, this gas becomes luminous and gives off a continuous whitish light. Thus provided for, I breathe and I see. Captain Nemo, to my every objection you give such crushing answers, I'm afraid to entertain a single doubt. However, though I have no choice but to accept both the Rouquayrol and Ruhmkorff devices, I'd like to register some reservations about the rifle with which you'll equip me. But it isn't a rifle that uses gunpowder, the captain replied. Then it's an air gun. Surely. How can I make gunpowder on my ship when I have no saltpeter, sulfur, or charcoal? Even so, I replied, to fire underwater in a medium that's 855 times denser than air, you'd have to overcome considerable resistance. That doesn't necessarily follow. There are certain Fulton-style guns perfected by the Englishmen Philippe Coles and Burley, the Frenchman Furcy, and the Italian Landi. They're equipped with a special system of airtight fastenings and can fire in underwater conditions. But I repeat, having no gunpowder, I've replaced it with air at high pressure, which is abundantly supplied me by the Nautilus's pumps. But this air must be swiftly depleted. Well, in a pinch, can't my Roquet roll tank supply me with more? All I have to do is draw it from an ad hoc spigot. Besides, Professor Aronnax, you'll see for yourself that during these underwater hunting trips, we make no great expenditure of either air or bullets. Latin, a spigot, just for that purpose, in quotes, Ed. But it seems to me that in this semi-darkness, amid this liquid that's so dense in comparison to the atmosphere, a gunshot couldn't carry far and would prove fatal only with difficulty. On the contrary, sir, with this rifle every shot is fatal, and as soon as the animal is hit, no matter how lightly, it falls as if struck by lightning. Why? Because this rifle doesn't shoot ordinary bullets, but little glass capsules invented by the Austrian chemist Leniebroek, and I have a considerable supply of them. These glass capsules are covered with a strip of steel and weighted with a lead base. They're genuine little Leyden jars charged with high voltage electricity. They go off at the slightest impact, and the animal, no matter how strong, drops dead. I might add that these capsules are no bigger than number 4 shot, and the chamber of any ordinary rifle could hold 10 of them. I'll quit debating, I replied, getting up from the table, and all that's left is for me to shoulder my rifle. So where you go, I'll go. Captain Nemo led me to the Nautilus's stern, and passing by Ned and Conseil's cabin, I summoned my 2 companions, who instantly followed us. Then we arrived at a cell located within easy access of the engine room. In this cell, we were to get dressed for our stroll. End of chapter 15. Recording by Elizabeth Morant, Port Richey, Florida. lizmorant@gmail.com. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Morant. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 16. Strolling the Plains. This cell, properly speaking, was the Nautilus's arsenal and wardrobe. Hanging from its walls, a dozen diving outfits were waiting for anybody who wanted to take a stroll. After seeing these, Ned Land exhibited an obvious distaste for the idea of putting one on. "But my gallant Ned," I told him, "the forests of Crespo Island are simply underwater forests." "Oh, great!" put in the disappointed harpooner, watching his dreams of fresh meat fade away. "And you, Professor Aronnax, are you going to stick yourself inside these clothes?" "It has to be, Mr. Ned." "Have it your way, sir," the harpooner replied, shrugging his shoulders. "But speaking for myself, I'll never get into those things unless they force me." "No one will force you, Mr. Land," Captain Nemo said. "And is Conseil going to risk it?" Ned asked. "Where master goes, I go," Conseil replied. At the captain's summons, 2 crewmen came to help us put on these heavy, waterproof clothes, made from seamless India rubber and expressly designed to bear considerable pressures. They were like suits of armor that were both yielding and resistant, you might say. These clothes consisted of jacket and pants. The pants ended in bulky footwear adorned with heavy lead soles. The fabric of the jacket was reinforced with copper mail that shielded the chest, protected it from the water's pressure, and allowed the lungs to function freely. The sleeves ended in supple gloves that didn't impede hand movements. These perfected diving suits, it was easy to see, were a far cry from such misshapen costumes as the cork breastplates, leather jumpers, seagoing tunics, barrel helmets, etc., invented and acclaimed in the 18th century. Conseil and I were soon dressed in these diving suits, as were Captain Nemo and one of his companions, a Herculean type who must have been prodigiously strong. All that remained was to encase one's head in its metal sphere. But before proceeding with this operation, I asked the captain for permission to examine the rifles set aside for us. One of the Nautilus's men presented me with a streamlined rifle whose butt was boilerplate steel, hollow inside and of fairly large dimensions. This served as a tank for the compressed air, which a trigger-operated valve could release into the metal chamber. In a groove where the butt was heaviest, a cartridge clip held some 20 electric bullets that, by means of a spring, automatically took their places in the barrel of the rifle. As soon as one shot had been fired, another was ready to go off. "Captain Nemo," I said, "this is an ideal, easy-to-use weapon. I ask only to put it to the test. But how will we reach the bottom of the sea?" "Right now, Professor, the Nautilus is aground in 10 meters of water, and we've only to depart." "But how will we set out?" "You'll see." Captain Nemo inserted his cranium into its spherical headgear. Conseil and I did the same, but not without hearing the Canadian toss us a sarcastic, "Happy hunting!" On top, the suit ended in a collar of threaded copper onto which the metal helmet was screwed. 3 holes, protected by heavy glass, allowed us to see in any direction with simply a turn of the head inside the sphere. Placed on our backs, the roquet-roll device went into operation as soon as it was in position, and for my part, I could breathe with ease. The Ruhmkorff lamp hanging from my belt, my rifle in hand, I was ready to go forth. But in all honesty, while imprisoned in these heavy clothes and nailed to the deck by my lead soles, it was impossible for me to take a single step. But this circumstance had been foreseen, because I felt myself propelled into a little room adjoining the wardrobe. Towed in the same way, my companions went with me. I heard a door with watertight seals close after us, and we were surrounded by profound darkness. After some minutes, a sharp hissing reached my ears. I felt a distinct sensation of cold rising from my feet to my chest. Apparently, a stopcock inside the boat was letting in water from outside, which overran us and soon filled up the room. Contrived in the Nautilus's side, a second door then opened. We were lit by a subdued light. An instant later, our feet were treading the bottom of the sea. And now, how can I convey the impressions left on me by this stroll under the waters? Words are powerless to describe such wonders. When even the painter's brush can't depict the effects unique to the liquid element, how can the writer's pen hope to reproduce them? Captain Nemo walked in front, and his companion followed us a few steps to the rear. Conseil and I stayed next to each other, as if daydreaming that through our metal carapaces, a little polite conversation might still be possible. Already I no longer felt the bulkiness of my clothes, footwear, and air tank, nor the weight of the heavy sphere inside which my head was rattling like an almond in its shell. Once immersed in water, all these objects lost a part of their weight equal to the weight of the liquid they displaced, and thanks to this law of physics discovered by Archimedes, I did just fine. I was no longer an inert mass, and I had, comparatively speaking, great freedom of movement. Lighting up the seafloor even 30 feet beneath the surface of the ocean, the sun astonished me with its power. The solar rays easily crossed this aqueous mass and dispersed its dark colors. I could easily distinguish objects 100 meters away. Farther on, the bottom was tinted with fine shades of ultramarine. Then, off in the distance, it turned blue and faded in the midst of a hazy darkness. Truly, this water surrounding me was just a kind of air, denser than the atmosphere on land, but almost as transparent. Above me, I could see the calm surface of the ocean. We were walking on sand that was fine-grained and smooth, not wrinkled like beach sand, which preserves the impressions left by the waves. This dazzling carpet was a real mirror, throwing back the sun's rays with startling intensity. The outcome? An immense vista of reflections that penetrated every liquid molecule. Will anyone believe me if I assert that at this 30-foot depth I could see as if it was broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour, I trod this blazing sand, which was strewn with tiny crumbs of seashell. Looming like a long reef, the Nautilus's hull disappeared little by little. But when night fell in the midst of the waters, the ship's beacon would surely facilitate our return on board, since its rays carried with perfect distinctness. This effect is difficult to understand for anyone who has never seen light beams so sharply defined on shore. There, the dust that saturates the air gives such rays the appearance of a luminous fog. But above water, as well as underwater, shafts of electric light are transmitted with incomparable clarity. Meanwhile, we went ever onward, and these vast plains of sand seemed endless. My hands parted liquid curtains that closed again behind me, and my footprints faded swiftly under the water's pressure. Soon, scarcely blurred by their distance from us, the forms of some objects took shape before my eyes. I recognized the lower slopes of some magnificent rocks carpeted by the finest zoophyte specimens, and right off, I was struck by an effect unique to this medium. By then, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. The sun's rays hit the surface of the waves at a fairly oblique angle, decomposing by refraction as though passing through a prism. And when this light came in contact with flowers, rocks, buds, seashells, and polyps, the edges of these objects were shaded with all 7 hues of the solar spectrum. This riot of rainbow tints was a wonder, a feast for the eyes, a genuine kaleidoscope of red, green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue. In short, the whole palette of a color-happy painter. If only I had been able to share with Conseil the intense sensations rising in my brain, competing with him in exclamations of wonderment. If only I had known, like Captain Nemo and his companion, how to exchange thoughts by means of prearranged signals. So, for lack of anything better, I talked to myself. I declaimed inside this copper box that topped my head, spending more air on empty words than was perhaps advisable. Conseil, like me, had stopped before this splendid sight. Obviously, in the presence of these zoophyte and mollusk specimens, the fine lad was classifying his head off. Polyps and echinoderms abounded on the sea floor, various Isis coral, cornellarian coral living in isolation, tufts of virginal genus Oculina formerly known by the name white coral, prickly fungus coral in the shape of mushrooms, sea anemone holding on by their muscular discs, providing a literal flower bed adorned by jellyfish from the genus Porpita wearing collars of azure tentacles, and starfish that spangled the sand, including vein-like feather stars from the genus Asterophyton that were like fine lace embroidered by the hands of water nymphs, their festoons swaying to the faint undulations caused by our walking. It filled me with real chagrin to crush underfoot the gleaming mollusk samples that littered the seafloor by the thousands. Concentric comb shells, hammer shells, coquina, seashells that actually hop around, top shell snails, red helmet shells, angel wing conchs, sea hares, and so many other exhibits from this inexhaustible ocean. But we had to keep walking, and we went forward while overhead there scudded schools of Portuguese men-of-war that let their ultramarine tentacles drift in their wakes, medusas whose milky white or dainty pink parasols were festooned with azure tassels and shaded us from the sun's rays, plus jellyfish of the species Pelagia panopyra that in the dark would have strewn our path with phosphorescent glimmers. All these wonders I glimpsed in the space of a quarter of a mile, barely pausing, following Captain Nemo, whose gestures kept beckoning me onward. Soon the nature of the seafloor changed. The plains of sand were followed by a bed of that viscous slime Americans call ooze, which is composed exclusively of seashells rich in limestone or silica. Then we crossed a prairie of algae, open sea plants that the waters hadn't yet torn loose, whose vegetation grew in wild profusion. Soft to the foot, these densely textured lawns would have rivaled the most luxuriant carpets woven by the hand of man. But while this greenery was sprawling under our steps, it didn't neglect us overhead. The surface of the water was crisscrossed by a floating arbor of marine plants belonging to that superabundant algae family that numbers more than 2,000 known species. I saw long ribbons of fucus drifting above me, some globular, others tubular, Laurentia, Cladostephus with the slenderest foliage, Rhodaminia palmata, resembling the fan shapes of cactus. I observed that green-colored plants kept closer to the surface of the sea, while reds occupied a medium depth, which left blacks and browns in charge of designing gardens and flower beds in the ocean's lower strata. These algae are a genuine prodigy of creation, one of the wonders of world flora. This family produces both the biggest and smallest vegetables in the world, because just as 40,000 near-invisible buds have been counted in one 5 square millimeter space, so also have fucus plants been gathered that were over 500 meters long. We had been gone from the Nautilus for about an hour and a half. It was almost noon. I spotted this fact in the perpendicularity of the sun's rays, which were no longer refracted. The magic of these solar colors disappeared little by little, with emerald and sapphire shades vanishing from our surroundings altogether. We walked with steady steps that rang on the seafloor with astonishing intensity. The tiniest sounds were transmitted with a speed to which the ear is unaccustomed on shore. In fact, water is a better conductor of sound than air, and under the waves noises carry 4 times as fast. Just then, the seafloor began to slope sharply downward. The light took on a uniform hue. We reached a depth of 100 meters, by which point we were undergoing a pressure of 10 atmospheres. But my diving clothes were built along such lines that I never suffered from this pressure. I felt only a certain tightness in the joints of my fingers, and even this discomfort soon disappeared. As for the exhaustion bound to accompany a 2-hour stroll in such unfamiliar trappings, it was nil. Helped by the water, my movements were executed with startling ease. Arriving at this 300-foot depth, I still detected the sun's rays, but just barely. Their intense brilliance had been followed by a reddish twilight, a midpoint between day and night. But we could see well enough to find our way, and it still wasn't necessary to activate the Ruhmkorff device. Just then, Captain Nemo stopped. He waited until I joined him. Then he pointed a finger at some dark masses outlined in the shadows a short distance away. "It's the forest of Crespo Island," I thought. And I was not mistaken. End of chapter 16. Recording by Elizabeth Morant, lizmorant@gmail.com.